Will you be working with him at that time?
No, I think we should have finished the film by then. I'll be working with him from March through the end of June or something like that.
Do you ever stop working?
Oh, God, yes. I sometimes don't do a picture for a year and a half.
On a cold March morning in 2007, the entire world of Hollywood was shaken to its core. A magazine called Hollywood Truth published a story that nobody saw coming. They had discovered the secret journal of Burt Lancaster, one of the greatest actors who ever lived. Lancaster was not just a movie star. He was a man of deep principle who had marched alongside Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights Movement. People respected him, people trusted him, so when his private journal was found, the world paid attention. But what was inside that journal was not a warm look back at a golden career. It was not a collection of fond memories or happy stories from the set. Instead, Lancaster had left behind something far more shocking, a handwritten list of 14 names. 14 of the most celebrated, most beloved figures from Hollywood's golden age. And next to those names, Lancaster had written his true feelings about each of them. He held nothing back. He described these people as the most ruthless, most dangerous, and most cruel individuals that Hollywood had ever produced. He pulled back the curtain on a world that had spent decades hiding its darkest secrets behind bright lights and beautiful smiles. What drove a man like Burt Lancaster to do this? What kind of pain, guilt, or rage pushes someone to leave behind a document like that as their final message to the world? Those are the questions we are going to explore today, name by name, story by story. And if you want to follow along for every shocking revelation in this list, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now, hit the like button, and turn on your notifications. We upload new stories like this regularly, and you do not want to miss what is coming. Now let's get into it, starting with the very first name on Lancaster's list, the one he considered the most dangerous of them all. The first name Burt Lancaster wrote down was Kirk Douglas. To the public, Douglas was a legend. He appeared in massive films, played powerful heroes, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that made audiences love him. He was the kind of star that people put on posters. But according to Lancaster's journal, the real Kirk Douglas was something very different from the man the world thought it knew. Lancaster described Douglas as a predator hiding behind a human face. He was not just ambitious in the way that most Hollywood figures are ambitious. He was something darker. According to Lancaster, Douglas was a man who used his fame, his money, and his connections as weapons. Anyone who stood in his way or refused to do what he wanted could find their careers suddenly falling apart, their opportunities disappearing, and their name quietly destroyed. One of the most disturbing stories Lancaster recorded involved a young actress named Lisa Avery. In 1959, Avery was said to appear in a major production, and by all accounts, she had earned her place in it. But then, she made one mistake, at least in the eyes of Kirk Douglas. She turned down his invitation to a private dinner. That was all it took. Shortly after, she was removed from the project entirely. Lancaster made clear that this was not a coincidence. It was a punishment, a message sent to her and to everyone else who might think about saying no to Douglas. But the cruelty described in Lancaster's journal went beyond career manipulation. Douglas was also accused of using illegal substances as tools of control. Lancaster claimed that Douglas bought and distributed drugs to directors, producers, and co-stars, using those substances to create situations where people felt they had no choice but to comply with his demands. Anyone who resisted would face what Lancaster described as severe consequences, including being physically placed in dangerous situations where the only safe option was silence and obedience. Lancaster's conclusion about Douglas was blunt. He was not just a difficult man or a demanding professional. He was, in Lancaster's own words, a monster who had spent his entire career building a system of fear around himself, destroying anyone who threatened his position at the top. The second name in the journal was Natalie Wood. and her story is every bit as disturbing as the first. Wood was known for her fragile beauty and her emotional performances. Audiences loved her, critics praised her. She seemed, on the surface, like one of the more sympathetic figures in Hollywood history, especially given the tragic circumstances of her death. But Lancaster painted a completely different picture. He described Wood as a cold and calculating manipulator who had mastered the art of using other people's emotions against them. She was not fragile, she only appeared fragile when it benefited her. One of the most memorable incidents Lancaster described involved a fellow actor on set that Wood simply did not like. Rather than raising her objections openly or professionally, Wood found another way. She staged a fainting spell, collapsing dramatically in the middle of production and bringing the entire set to a halt. The production stayed frozen for 10 full hours. When a director finally had the opportunity to speak with her, she made her demands clear. The actor she disliked needed to go. The threat was obvious. Either he leaves or the delays continue. The actor was eventually removed. Lancaster wrote that Wood created a constant atmosphere of fear around herself. People were too scared to speak out against her because they knew what she was capable of. One wrong move could mean the end of your career. One refusal could mean being made an example of. Then there's the matter of her death in 1981, when she drowned after falling from a yacht. Lancaster hinted in his journal that her death was not the accident it appeared to be. He suggested that the years of manipulation and deception she had engaged in had finally caught up to her. A journalist from a well-known Hollywood publication reported that just weeks before her death, Wood had allegedly threatened to destroy the career of a close friend who would refuse to do something she had asked. Lancaster wrote that the sea had not killed her, it had only hidden what she had left behind on dry land. Whether one agrees with his interpretation or not, it is clear that Lancaster saw her death as the final consequence of a life spent using and betraying the people around her. The third name was Mickey Rooney, and this one might surprise people the most. Rooney spent his entire career being known as one of the warmest, most approachable figures in Hollywood. He had a big smile, a big laugh, and an energy that made everyone feel welcome. That image, Lancaster claimed, was entirely fake. Behind the scenes, Rooney was described as someone who genuinely enjoyed causing pain. Lancaster used the word sadist, saying that Rooney took real pleasure in watching other people suffer. His favorite targets were background actors and crew members, people who had little power and even less ability to defend themselves. He would single them out in front of everyone, mocking them about small and irrelevant things, like how they had styled their hair that day or what they were wearing. He would not stop until he had made them feel worthless, and then, Lancaster wrote, he would smile as if he had just won a prize. His personal life was even darker. Lancaster alleged that Rooney treated his wives not as partners, but as property. He controlled their lives through fear and intimidation. His marriages, of which there were many, were not love stories by any definition. They were traps. Lancaster described them as cycles of abuse where Rooney would systematically break his partners down until they no longer had the strength to resist him. One of the most painful incidents Lancaster recorded from 1970 involved Rooney physically striking his wife on a film set because she had fallen behind schedule. This was not a private moment, it happened in front of other people. Yet, because of who Rooney was and how much power he held, nothing was done. Lancaster saw Rooney's long string of failed marriages not as the sad love life of a complicated man, but as a documented trail of abuse that nobody had ever been willing to hold him accountable for. The fourth name was Elizabeth Taylor, arguably the biggest star ever to come out of Hollywood's golden age. Taylor was glamour itself. She was beautiful, talented, and magnetic. She was also, if Lancaster's account is to be believed, one of the most manipulative people who ever worked in the industry. The most famous incident Lancaster recorded took place during the filming of Cleopatra in 1962 at the famous Cinecittà Studios in Rome. Production ground to a complete standstill for 14 hours because Taylor locked herself in her dressing room. The reason? A co-star had worn a dress in the same color as one of her costumes. When the director went to speak with her, hoping to resolve the situation and get filming back on track, Taylor responded by throwing a glass of wine directly into his face. The crew stood frozen. Nobody said a word. But Taylor's manipulation was not just limited to dramatic outbursts. Lancaster wrote that she was a strategic operator who used her personal relationships as business tools. During her marriage to Richard Burton in the 1960s, she allegedly took complete control of his career. Their relationship became a form of leverage that she used to pressure producers and studio executives into doing what she wanted. Lancaster's view of Taylor's many marriages, from Mike Todd to Burton and beyond, was that none of them were true love stories. They were calculated arrangements designed to increase her power and extract wealth from the men involved. Lancaster's portrait of Taylor was that of someone who wore glamour as armor and used beauty as a weapon, while underneath she was running a very cold and very deliberate operation. The fifth name on the list was Spencer Tracy, a man considered by many to be the finest screen actor of his generation. Tracy's performances were quiet, deep, and real in a way that few actors have ever managed. Off-screen, Lancaster's journal told a very different story. Tracy was described as a man who lived in a permanent storm of rage, and that storm was almost always fueled by alcohol. Lancaster was careful to point out that the drinking was not just a personal problem or a weakness, it was a deliberate tool that Tracy used to intimidate the people around him. He drank in order to become dangerous, and becoming dangerous was how he stayed in control. The allegations Lancaster recorded went beyond drinking and intimidation. Tracy was accused of sexual assault and physical violence, sometimes occurring directly on the sets of his films. One incident from 1961, during the production of the acclaimed film Judgment at Nuremberg, involved Tracy smashing a liquor bottle against a makeup table simply because a makeup artist had made a small error. The crew was left shaken and silent. Lancaster also wrote about Tracy's psychological methods of control. He would invade the privacy of his co-stars, gathering information that he could use against them. He was not above threatening extreme behavior, including threatening self-harm in order to force co-stars into doing what he wanted. Lancaster summed him up as a man who had perfected the performance of goodness for public consumption, while privately operating as a bully who left fear in every room he walked into. The sixth name was James Stewart, and this one is perhaps the most jarring of all. Stewart was not just a popular actor, he was a symbol of American goodness. His characters were decent, honest, hard-working, and moral. Films like It's a Wonderful Life and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington turned him into a national icon. He represented something that Americans wanted to believe about themselves.
Lancaster's account of the real James Stewart dismantled all of that. According to the journal, Stewart was a calculating and cold-blooded manipulator who quietly destroyed the careers of people he considered threats or obstacles. His methods were subtle, which made them even more effective. He would watch his co-stars closely during filming, noting down every mistake they made, and then pass those notes to the director after the day's shoot was finished. He never confronted anyone directly. He worked through back channels, planting seeds of doubt and undermining confidence without ever showing his hand. In 1957, Stewart allegedly refused to work alongside a black actor on a production. Rather than being honest about his reasoning, he invented a cover story, claiming that the script's requirements made it impossible for the actor to be involved. Nobody challenged him. Nobody dared. But Lancaster's most disturbing claim about Stewart involved the forging of documents. Stewart allegedly created false paperwork to accuse actors who had crossed him, using fabricated evidence to damage their reputations and force them off productions. The tactic was devastatingly effective because no one had the courage to push back against someone of Stewart's stature. Lancaster concluded that Stewart never needed to raise his voice or make an open threat. His presence alone was enough to make people feel small and uncertain. The seventh name was Marilyn Monroe, And before going any further, it is worth noting that the portrait Lancaster painted of her is radically different from the one that has dominated popular culture. Monroe has long been seen as a victim, a fragile and exploited woman who is ultimately destroyed by the man and systems around her. Lancaster's journal presented her as something far more complicated. According to Lancaster, Monroe was not fragile, she played fragile, and she played it brilliantly because vulnerability was her most powerful weapon. She used her appearance of emotional instability to manipulate everyone around her, from co-stars to directors to studio executives, bending productions and people to serve her own interests. During the filming of Some Like It Hot in 1959, one of the most celebrated comedies ever made, Monroe would disappear from the set without any warning, sometimes for hours at a time. The entire production would stop and wait. Directors, crew members, and fellow cast members would sit idle while Monroe was wherever she chose to be. Nobody could do anything about it because the film needed her, and she knew it. Lancaster went further, claiming that Monroe's behavior crossed into harassment. She would push and pressure people relentlessly until they gave her what she wanted, using emotional breakdowns as instruments of coercion. He described a situation in 1961 involving film producer Jack Warner. Monroe had begun a secret affair with Warner, and when he suggested that she work alongside another actor she did not want to work with, she allegedly staged an intense emotional collapse that left Warner feeling he had no choice but to back down. Lancaster's Monroe was not a sad, exploited woman. She was a skilled operator who understood exactly what she was doing. The eighth figure in the journal was Errol Flynn, who was famous for playing dashing adventure heroes in swashbuckling films that made him one of the biggest stars of the 1930s and 1940s. Lancaster's description of Flynn was among the darkest in the entire journal. Flynn hosted parties that, according to Lancaster, were far from the glamorous gatherings they appeared to be. Behind closed doors, those parties reportedly involved drugs, exploitation, and violence. The people who attended and witnessed what happened were too frightened to speak about it afterward, and Flynn's powerful connections in Hollywood ensured that even when he crossed serious legal lines, the consequences were minimal. Lancaster alleged that Flynn was arrested for drug trafficking at one point and yet walked away from it essentially untouched, his power and reputation intact. The women in Flynn's life were, in Lancaster's words, treated as disposable tools. He would pursue them, win them over using his extraordinary charm, and then discard them the moment they were no longer useful to him. Lancaster did not see Flynn as a flawed romantic or a complicated personality. He saw him as a predator who had found the perfect environment in which to operate without facing justice. The eighth figure in the journal was Bing Crosby, perhaps the most universally beloved entertainer of the 20th century. Crosby had a voice, a manner, and an image that made him seem like the safest and most trustworthy man in the world. In public, he was patient, kind, and endlessly charming. Lancaster's account of what went on behind Crosby's closed doors was deeply unsettling. Lancaster claimed that Crosby's public warmth disappeared completely at home. His children lived under a regime of fear, and the weapon Crosby used most often was not violence, but something perhaps more insidious: emotional cruelty delivered through icy silence and withering contempt. A single piercing stare from their father was apparently enough to break their children's spirit entirely. But it did not stop at emotional cruelty. Lancaster recorded one incident in which Crosby forced one of his sons to stand shirtless outside in freezing temperatures as punishment for receiving a poor grade at school. Crosby reportedly told the boy that the cold was meant to teach him the feeling of failure. Lancaster alleged that Crosby used threats of physical harm to control not just his children, but other family members as well. What gives Lancaster's account particular weight in this case is that Bing Crosby's son, Gary, later confirmed much of it in his own published memoir. Gary Crosby wrote that he would rather have been the son of anyone else in the world, even a convicted criminal, than the son of Bing Crosby. Those are devastating words from a son about his father, and they line up closely with what Lancaster had written in private decades earlier.
The 10th name was Gary Crosby himself. This is where Lancaster's account takes an especially tragic turn, because Gary was not just a perpetrator in Lancaster's eyes, he was also a victim, someone who'd been so thoroughly broken by his father's cruelty that he had become a distorted reflection of it. Gary had been beaten as a child, sometimes with a golf club, according to Lancaster's account. He grew into an adult who was defined by rage and emotional instability. He allegedly abused the women in his life, repeating toward his girlfriends what had been done to him at home. He was said to have assaulted people over minor and almost meaningless disputes. On one occasion, he reportedly smashed a film director's windshield simply because he had not been included in a dinner invitation. Lancaster also alleged that Gary was involved in drug use, prostitution networks, and random acts of violence that reflected a complete inability to manage his emotions or his behavior. Lancaster's conclusion about Gary was perhaps the most compassionate passage in an otherwise damning document. He wrote that Gary did not know how to love anyone. He only knew how to make people afraid. And the reason for that, Lancaster said, was simple. Fear was the only language his father had ever taught him. The journal did not stop there. Lancaster went on to describe 4 more figures in rapid succession, and each portrait was as harsh as those that came before. Henry Fonda, celebrated as one of Hollywood's great moral voices and known for playing principled characters who stood up for justice, was described by Lancaster as deeply cold and emotionally abusive in his real life. Lancaster claimed that Fonda used psychological control over both his family members and his professional colleagues to keep power firmly in his own hands. The warmth and integrity he projected on screen was, in Lancaster's view, a performance and nothing more. Jane Fonda, Henry's daughter, and a successful actress and activist in her own right, was characterized by Lancaster as someone who used her celebrity and her strong political beliefs as instruments of pressure and division. According to the journal, she worked to sideline and eliminate people in the industry who disagreed with her views, using her platform not to invite conversation, but to punish opposition. Joan Crawford, who had been celebrated during her career and has since been the subject of enormous amounts of public scrutiny, was described by Lancaster as an abusive mother who used violence and drugs to control her children at home. The accounts in the journal echoed claims that others had made about Crawford over the years, presenting a home life that was the polar opposite of the fashionable image she worked so hard to maintain in public. And finally, Lucille Ball, the woman who made the world laugh and who built one of the most successful production companies in television history, was painted by Lancaster as a psychological tyrant in the workplace. Ball allegedly kept detailed written records of every mistake made by the people who worked for her, using those records as tools for punishment and control. Even more disturbing, Lancaster claimed that she had hidden microphones installed in her workplace to secretly monitor her employees' conversations. The warm, bumbling, lovable character she played on television was, in Lancaster's account, the complete opposite of who she was when the camera stopped rolling. Lancaster ended his journal with words that read, according to those who discovered it, like a final warning. He described the document as a blood-stained account of the truths that Hollywood had spent decades working to bury. These were not isolated incidents or isolated individuals, he wrote. This was a pattern, a system, a culture in which cruelty and manipulation were not exceptions, but methods of survival and tools of power. What do we do with a document like this? That is a question worth sitting with. Lancaster was himself a complex figure, a man with his own flaws and his own history. He was not a perfect witness or a neutral observer, but he was there. He lived through all of it. He knew these people personally. And the fact that he chose to leave behind this particular document as his final statement about the world he had spent his life in says something powerful about what he had seen and what he felt could no longer go unsaid. The golden age of Hollywood was real. The films were extraordinary. The talent was genuine. But behind the glamour, there were people living very different lives from the ones they showed to the world. There were patterns of abuse, exploitation, manipulation, and silence that went on for decades because the people involved were too powerful to challenge and too famous to expose. Burt Lancaster decided to challenge them anyway. Not with a lawsuit, not with a press conference, but with 14 names and the truth he believed the world deserved to hear.